I'm not much of a wrestling guy. It doesn't take more than one look at this physique to gather that information, does it? But I do know about the Von Erich curse in wrestling, or the Von Erich family, I should say, as a whole in wrestling. And my admittedly very limited knowledge of that side of things is that they're an incredibly prolific family within the wrestling world, and that a lot of incredibly fucked up, depressing shit, tragic shit happened to them. So when I found out Sean Durkin was doing a film adaptation of the family's tragic life events, my interest was piqued. And yeah, I suppose to no one's surprise, The Iron Claw, said film, is an absolute gut punch of a film. I won't go into too much detail on the life of these brothers and what ends up happening to this family if you don't already know the story. Needless to say though, it is a series of events and decades that are just littered with incredibly tragic moments, all of which led to the naming of the Von Erich curse. And immediately that premise is really ripe for an interesting look at, I suppose, the stories that we attach to tragic events in people's lives. And that's where I was interested to see how Sean Durkin might do with this subject matter. I was a really, really big fan of his previous work, The Nest, but I've enjoyed all of his films. And again, he's created a film which feels like it plays with the medium in a really effective way. Like the visual look of his films and the tone that he's able to get from that side of things goes a really long way into just kind of soaking you into specific themes and getting into the headspaces of his characters. The film opens with this immediately very striking black and white, almost noir sequence, which is set a little further in the past, and I was just really immediately kind of hooked on the way that Durkin was going to tell this story visually. It's stylish and moody, I think, in a really, really effective way. I was really impressed, I think, with the way that the film looks at wrestling, and that comes from, of course, the way that Durkin and the cinematographer here shoots the wrestling. I mean, there's some amazing sequences, particularly towards the middle of the film, montages in which we see the characters in the ring, and it's just got this real sort of energy to it, which I think makes it feel immediately really kind of energetic and revitalizing as a sport. But also the way that characters talk about the wrestling in the screenplay and to one another here adds interesting enough layers to the perspective on the wrestling that's happening in the film. And that nuance, I think, makes it a bit more accessible overall for audiences that might be really into their wrestling and audiences like me who just aren't really into wrestling at all. It's a film, I suppose, of two halves, in which the first is an introduction to these characters and seeing the way that each of the brothers tackles the sport or ends up sort of, for lack of a better word, leveling up through the sport around each other. And then the second half, I suppose, is the consequences of that incredible kind of rise through that sporting world. And I think that does make the film feel a little bit uneven overall. I was much more engaged and interested in the building of this world in the first half. I think that's where Durkin's filmmaking really comes out. There's some really amazing intimate work with the brothers that does a great job of building the chemistry and the brotherhood. But there's also in that first half this looming sense of foreboding, like something is going to go wrong here. It's just a matter of when. And I think that space is where Sean Durkin's filmmaking sits most comfortably. Or comfortable is the wrong word there, because I think it's actually almost the opposite of that. It is this kind of strange, off-kilter, unnerving vibe to his filmmaking that is so great in that sense. But once you get to the second half and consequences of things, where I think the film needs to explore things a little bit deeper, I'm not convinced it's as effective. I was still invested, and I did find it impactful what ends up happening in the film, and I think the characters and the performances do such a great job of keeping things on track there. But I think the film struggles a little bit with this kind of idea of foreshadowing and the ultimate tragedy that ends up happening. It's clearly an intention in the film, and I think it's clearly such a vital part of the real life story there. There is this curse that has been labelled on things, and that adds this sense of uneasy foreshadowing to everything they do in their lives. So I don't think that the film would have worked at all without all of that stuff. But sometimes that foreshadowing leans a little too far into inevitability, and I think that can sometimes get in the way of the impact of the tragedy that's actually happening in the second half. And I think part of that comes from the pace of which things are got through in this film. There's a lot happening in this film, and although it is still a 2-hour plus film, in terms of Sean Durkin's filmography, it feels like his sort of quickest film yet. And I was surprised to see that he doesn't take as sort of long and a patient approach to things as he has done previously. That actually ends up being a real benefit of the film in its first half, but I kind of ended up missing that more patient exploration of themes in the second half. I think it would have really helped things just to sit with things a little longer. And I don't mean just really kind of reveling in the tragedy and the trauma that's going on. I just mean giving things a bit more space to breathe, to make those moments feel a little bit more deeper, I suppose, overall. Because what actually ends up happening is that you end up condensing a lot of really complex things into single scenes and single character confrontations that I don't think necessarily end up helping those themes in the long run. And it makes the film feel simpler than I was expecting in the stuff that it explores. That isn't always terrible, and I don't think it completely derails things for that. I was still engaged and I still really, really liked the film overall. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had quite a simple way of looking at a father pushing its sons too far and the outcome of that. And it wouldn't have been as much a problem if it didn't hint in the build-up of that in the first half at more complex things around that. That being said though, part of the reason that is still effective is the performances at hand here, and the way that Durkin and those performances create such a believable and authentic kind of brotherhood between everyone on screen. Zac Efron in the lead here is really, really great. I mean, you've no doubt heard a lot of things about his performance at this point, and he is fantastic, and this is probably the best we've ever seen him. And he really does do such a fantastic job of highlighting the exact kind of cross points of wanting to push yourself too far, knowing you're pushing yourself too far, and being stuck in that kind of environment, in that world. But the rest of the cast around him, the brothers in the film, are all doing their own individual work, which is also great, and again creates this really unique sort of family bond between them all. Harris Dickinson's in the film, big fan of him. There's also Jeremy Allen White. Again, really, really great. But I think I was almost most taken by Stanley Simon's role here as the fourth Von Erich brother. The brother that isn't in that wrestling world. He's a musician. I didn't know anything about this character in real life. I mean, I didn't really know much about any of the specifics of the Von Erich brothers in this family outside of the tragedy and the curse. But I found myself really attached to his side of things here, and I loved what he brought to this role. But sometimes, particularly in the second half, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more from those brothers before we end up coming to the crux of their storylines. And that is a general point on the film that is a knock for me, that I think pulled it back from real greatness, as I have seen other people loving it. And that is the way that it does get to its climaxes and wrap things up in its storylines. And honestly, the biggest example of that is the very end of this film. I don't want to spoil how the film ends or where it ends up going, but the final scene of this film is a perfect example of a film that has already got to the thing it's trying to say, and then just kind of saying it to us as a viewer. And there are multiple scenes like that littered through the second half of this film that just push it a little bit too far for me. I don't need characters to tell me the thing that we've just seen them showing. But overall, the Iron Claw did a lot of great stuff for me, and I really enjoyed, perhaps that's not a good word for how depressing and tragic a story this is, but I was really interested and invested in the way that Sean Durkin chose to show this story. The performances are great, the look of the film's great, it's presented really well. I was a little let down by the way that it gets to the places it needs to get to in the end, but it's a good enough time overall, and I think it's going to do really, really well. It has been doing very, very well everywhere it's been showing. It's no surprise to me that audiences are really connecting with it, and that's good. I definitely do think it is worth a watch. It's definitely worth checking out. But if you have seen it, or if you're excited to see it, please do let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below, and we'll have a little chat. Would love a subscribe and a like if you're feeling generous. Don't have to, but if you don't, I will find you. I will see you guys very soon for some more thoughts on more films. But until next time, yeah, can someone get Zac Efron a hug? Someone?